Some of Egypt's most unsettling discoveries were never meant to be seen again. Sealed tombs, disturbed burials, cryptic inscriptions, and unexplained deaths continue to cast a shadow over places once built for eternity. Every fragment carries a trace of something difficult to reconstruct, and some evidence remains stubbornly silent. So sit back, relax, and let's explore Egypt's most haunting mysteries. At Tel el-Daba, where the remains of ancient Avaris lie scattered across Egypt's eastern delta, archaeologists uncovered a disturbing arrangement unlike almost anything else from the period. Human right hands, carefully placed inside pits near a Hyksos palace. The discovery dates to the 15th dynasty, around 1640 to 1530 BC, when Avaris served as a major center of Hyksos power. The hands were not random fragments swept into a burial. They had been deliberately separated from the forearms, positioned with their fingers spread wide, and deposited in several pits within the palace complex. Earlier reports counted 16 hands. Later, osteological analysis established that at least 12 adults were represented, 11 male and possibly 1 female. Their location is perhaps the most revealing detail. The pits lay in a courtyard in front of the throne room, a setting that would have made the deposits visible to people moving through the palace. This raises the possibility that the hands were not simply discarded remains, but objects with a specific political or ceremonial purpose. By the beginning of Egypt's new kingdom, severed hands are clearly associated with warfare. Tomb inscriptions describe Egyptian soldiers presenting the right hands of defeated enemies to the king, allowing officials to count casualties and recognize individual warriors. In return, successful soldiers could receive the prestigious Gold of Valor. Temple reliefs later portray piles of hands displayed before victorious rulers. Yet, the Avaris discovery presents a difficult chronological problem. The hands were deposited during the Hyksos period, before this practice becomes clearly documented in Egyptian military records. The evidence therefore sits at a fascinating point between archaeology and history. Were the hands an early form of the military trophy system later adopted by Egyptian rulers, or did they represent something quite different? One possibility is that they were trophies taken from enemies after combat. Their careful preparation and placement would fit a practice intended to demonstrate victory and quantify success. The fact that only right hands were selected also corresponds with later Egyptian military traditions. But no inscription at the site directly explains who the victims were, who removed their hands, or why these particular remains were placed beside the palace. Another interpretation takes the evidence in a different direction. Some scholars have proposed that the Hyksos themselves may have used severing as a form of punishment or royal retribution, perhaps influenced by practices known elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Under this reading, the courtyard was not necessarily a place where soldiers presented battlefield trophies, but somewhere the consequences of royal authority were made visible. There is an even darker uncertainty. Osteological examination cannot establish whether the hands were removed from people who were already dead or from individuals who were still alive. The bones preserve evidence of deliberate removal, but not the precise circumstances surrounding the act. Researchers have also suggested that the hands were likely taken locally because they appear to have been intact when buried and were not mummified. So, the pits at Avaris leave us with an unsettling fragment of human behavior, preserved almost perfectly in the archaeological record. Were these trophies of war, instruments of royal punishment, or evidence of a tradition whose origins remain outside Egypt? The hands can reveal how carefully they were treated after removal, but not the final story of the people to whom they once belonged. The sun rises over el-Kab, the ancient royal cemetery at Abydos, illuminating low mud-brick walls and the remains of a burial complex built at the very beginning of Egypt's first dynasty. Here, the tomb attributed to King Aha was surrounded not only by the architecture of kingship, but by rows of smaller graves containing the remains of young people. Their presence creates one of the most unsettling questions surrounding Egypt's earliest rulers. Aha, also known as Hor-Aha, ruled around 2950 BC during the formative period when Egypt's early state was taking shape. His burial complex contained numerous subsidiary graves, arranged in an unusually organized pattern around the royal tomb. Archaeological studies describe 3 parallel rows of graves associated with the tomb, containing predominantly young males, many estimated to have been between roughly 20 and 25 years old. At first glance, the arrangement seems to suggest deliberate accompaniment. These were not simply people buried somewhere nearby. Their graves were incorporated into the royal funerary landscape, creating a physical connection between the ruler and those who surrounded him in death. For more than a century, Egyptologists have debated what that connection actually meant. The traditional interpretation is stark. These individuals may have been royal retainers, servants, officials, craftsmen, or members of the king's household, killed at the time of Aha's funeral, so that they could continue serving him in the afterlife. The idea became known as retainer sacrifice, and the evidence from Aha's complex has often been regarded as an early indication that such a practice existed in Egypt. The architecture provides part of the argument. Many subsidiary graves were constructed as components of the larger royal complex, making it difficult to imagine them simply being added over many decades as individuals died naturally. Some researchers have argued that their arrangement and construction suggest a relatively concentrated burial event connected with the king's death. Yet, architecture alone cannot reveal how those people died. That distinction is crucial. For decades, the physical remains were not considered sufficient to prove sacrifice beyond doubt. Earlier excavations often lacked the modern forensic methods needed to identify subtle evidence of trauma, leaving open another possibility. Perhaps these individuals had been granted the extraordinary privilege of being buried close to their ruler, dying naturally or through circumstances that remain unknown. Their proximity to Aha may therefore represent either coercion or status. And then there is another possibility, that the truth changed from one individual to another. Some of those buried around early kings may have been deliberately killed, while others could have died naturally and received prestigious burials as part of the royal household. The evidence may not fit neatly into a single explanation. Recent bioarchaeological research has reopened the subject further. A 2026 reassessment of human remains from First Dynasty royal complexes at Abydos reports evidence of perimortem trauma that earlier excavators failed to interpret correctly, strengthening the case that violence played a role in at least some of these burials. At the same time, the researchers emphasize that older collections require careful reassessment rather than automatic acceptance of traditional conclusions. If people really were sacrificed for Aha, the implications reach beyond the graves themselves. It would suggest that at the dawn of dynastic Egypt, royal authority could extend beyond controlling land, labor, and wealth. It could determine who accompanied a ruler into eternity. But were these young people unwilling victims, honored retainers, or individuals whose final circumstances varied from case to case? The silent rows around Aha's tomb offer no inscription explaining their fate. And as modern examination continues to revisit those ancient remains, the question remains open. How many stories of the first Egyptian kings are still waiting to emerge from the graves surrounding them? From the sun-baked cemeteries of predynastic Egypt comes another unsettling trace of human behavior: burials in which the skeleton does not always rest in the orderly arrangement expected of a complete body. Long before pyramids, royal tombs, and elaborate mummification, communities along the Nile were already developing complex traditions surrounding death. Yet, some graves contained bodies whose bones were scattered, rearranged, or separated in ways that remain difficult to interpret. The evidence comes from cemeteries dating to the 4th millennium BC and earlier, including sites in Upper Egypt and the Nile Valley. These communities lived during a period of profound social transformation, when farming settlements, regional identities, craft traditions, and emerging systems of authority were gradually taking shape. Burial customs varied considerably. Many individuals were placed on their sides in contracted positions, commonly with the knees drawn toward the chest. Grave goods could include pottery, stone tools, beads, pallets, animal remains, and personal ornaments. Such objects suggest that burial was not simply the disposal of a body. It could express identity, status, relationships, and beliefs about death. But some graves are harder to explain. Archaeologists have documented skeletons showing missing bones, displaced limbs, unusual positioning, and evidence suggesting that bodies may sometimes have been disturbed after burial. In certain cases, anatomical connections are absent where they would normally be expected. The crucial question is whether these arrangements resulted from deliberate human action, or from the natural processes that affect a body after burial. That distinction matters enormously. Once buried, a body does not remain perfectly still. Decomposition causes joints to separate. Soil pressure can shift bones. Animals may disturb graves, water can move smaller elements, and later burials can cut through earlier ones. Even the excavation process itself can complicate the original arrangement. What appears disturbing today may therefore have developed gradually through entirely natural processes. Yet, not every case is easily dismissed. Some researchers have considered whether particular dismembered remains reflect deliberate treatment of the dead. One possibility is secondary burial, in which a body was initially placed somewhere, allowed to decompose, and later rearranged before receiving a final burial. In societies where death was understood as a process rather than a single moment, manipulating skeletal remains may have carried religious or social meaning. Another possibility is ritual fragmentation. The deliberate separation of body parts is known from various prehistoric societies, although each culture must be considered on its own evidence. Fragmentation could potentially have been associated with transformation, ancestor veneration, mortuary rites, or changing concepts of bodily identity. But finding separated bones alone does not prove that such rituals occurred in pre-dynastic Egypt. There are also more troubling interpretations. Could some damaged or incomplete skeletons represent violence? In certain prehistoric Egyptian remains, researchers have identified trauma consistent with interpersonal conflict, although trauma, dismemberment, and post-mortem disturbance are separate phenomena and should not automatically be connected. A body showing injuries does not necessarily mean that its later burial arrangement was violent. This uncertainty makes the pre-dynastic evidence so compelling. These were communities living thousands of years before Egypt developed the elaborate funerary systems later associated with pharaohs. Their cemeteries provide glimpses into a world where ideas about the body, death, and the afterlife were still evolving. Perhaps the unusual graves represent ritual practices that disappeared as Egyptian society changed. Perhaps they reflect exceptional individuals rather than a widespread tradition. Or perhaps natural processes have transformed ordinary burials into something far more enigmatic. Every displaced bone becomes part of that debate. And as archaeologists return to old cemeteries with modern osteological methods, the possibility remains that these fragmented burials may reveal beliefs about death that written history never recorded. Were these bodies deliberately transformed after death, disturbed by later events, or simply reshaped by thousands of years in the earth? The answer remains uncertain, and somewhere within those ancient graves, the evidence may still be waiting to tell us. From the shadowed cliffs of Deir el-Bahari comes a burial unlike the orderly tombs normally associated with ancient Egyptian officials. Cut into the limestone of the North Assasif, tomb MMA 507 contained the remains of roughly 60 soldiers, their bodies gathered together after death. Some still retain traces of military equipment, including arrows and an archer's wrist guard. The scene suggested violence, but the circumstances remained uncertain. The tomb was discovered by Herbert Eustace Winlock during excavations conducted by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 1920s. Winlock initially connected the soldiers with the turbulent period surrounding the reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II, proposing that they had fallen during a conflict between Thebes and its northern rival, Hierakonpolis. According to his reconstruction, the bodies may have remained exposed on the battlefield before being recovered, wrapped, and given an honorable burial near the Royal Mortuary Complex. But later research complicated that picture. The tomb is now generally associated with the early 12th dynasty, rather than the reign of Mentuhotep II. Archaeological and textual evidence has suggested a date around the reign of Senusret I, roughly 1961 to 1917 BC. Inscribed linen fragments found among the remains, along with the style of military equipment, played an important role in reassessing the original chronology. That change in date matters because it separates the soldiers from the specific battle Winlock originally imagined. Still, the physical evidence preserves something unmistakable. Many of the bodies displayed injuries associated with warfare, including arrow wounds. Some remains were found dismembered, contributing to the tomb's enduring reputation as a burial of decapitated soldiers. Yet, the evidence does not necessarily indicate that the men were executed or deliberately mutilated after capture. Their bodies may have been damaged during combat, scavenged after death, or disturbed before they were finally placed inside the tomb. This distinction becomes particularly important when examining the absence of clear hand-to-hand combat injuries. Winlock noted that the remains did not show the kind of trauma he expected from close fighting, while arrows provided more direct evidence of how at least some of the men had died. Could they have been struck while retreating? Were they archers themselves, caught in a larger battlefield assault? Or did something happen to their bodies after the fighting ended? The tomb itself offers another clue. Rather than being an ordinary private burial, MMA 507 had an unusual, almost catacomb-like arrangement. The soldiers were placed together within a rock-cut complex near the monumental landscape associated with royal funerary architecture. Their collective burial suggests that whoever organized it considered these men worthy of being gathered and protected in death. The current archaeological project at North Assasif continues to study the tomb and its human remains, with specialized work in physical anthropology and other fields. One interpretation is therefore relatively straightforward. These were soldiers who died in battle and were later given a collective burial. In this reading, the apparent horror of the tomb comes not from ritual execution, but from the ordinary brutality of warfare and the difficult process of recovering bodies from an ancient battlefield. Yet another possibility has occasionally attracted attention: the idea that some of the dismemberment occurred after death through deliberate treatment of the bodies. Such an act could theoretically have resulted from enemy desecration, battlefield practices, or practical handling of corpses. There is, however, no secure evidence establishing such a motive. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes Tomb 507 so compelling. The soldiers left behind names, fragments of linen, weapons, wounds, and scattered bones, but no surviving account explaining the final moments of their lives. They may have died defending a kingdom, fighting far from home, or participating in a campaign whose details have disappeared from historical memory. What happened between the battlefield and the tomb remains partly obscured. Were these men simply casualties gathered for a final act of respect, or did their bodies endure another chapter of violence after death? Among the limestone passages of MMA 507, the evidence remains incomplete, and the silence of roughly 60 soldiers still leaves room for questions that archaeology has not yet been able to answer. The desert cemetery of el-Kab lies on the western edge of Abydos, where the limestone cliffs give way to a vast, silent plain. Here, more than 5,000 years ago, Egypt's earliest rulers constructed monumental underground tombs, marking the emergence of a royal tradition that would eventually shape Egyptian civilization for millennia. Yet, when archaeologists entered some of these chambers, they encountered an unsettling absence. The tombs of kings were present, but the bodies they were built to protect were often missing. Among the earliest royal monuments are the tombs associated with rulers such as Narmer, Hor-Aha, Deir, Djet, and Den, dating to the First Dynasty, roughly around 3100 to 2900 BC. These structures were not simple graves. Their architecture, scale, and surrounding subsidiary burials reveal an emerging concept of kingship, in which the ruler's identity continued beyond physical death. But what happened to the bodies? The answer is more complicated than the empty chambers might suggest. Many of these tombs were plundered repeatedly over thousands of years. Valuable objects, precious materials, and anything that could be reused were vulnerable to ancient robbers. Royal mummies themselves could also be disturbed, relocated, or destroyed during later periods when Egyptian authorities attempted to protect the remains of earlier kings from continuing attacks. This is particularly important at Abydos. During the New Kingdom, priests and officials appear to have taken measures to safeguard royal remains from earlier dynasties. Some royal mummies found elsewhere in Egypt had been carefully rewrapped and placed together in hidden caches, suggesting that ancient Egyptians themselves understood the danger facing their predecessors' tombs. Yet, the situation at el-Kab remains unusually difficult to reconstruct. The tomb attributed to Deir, for example, was later associated with the cult of Osiris. When archaeologists entered the chamber in modern times, they discovered a remarkably preserved arm wrapped in linen, complete with bracelets. It was once interpreted as the remains of Deir himself, although the identity of the arm has never been established with absolute certainty. Was it part of the original burial, a later offering, or a surviving fragment from an individual whose body had been disturbed long before modern excavation? Other tombs present different problems. The burial chamber of Den was found with substantial architectural remains and evidence of an elaborate royal burial, yet no intact royal body survived. Tombs connected with other early rulers likewise preserve objects, architecture, and traces of funerary activity without providing an uninterrupted chain from the original burial to a confirmed royal mummy. One straightforward explanation is ancient looting. The earliest royal tombs were repeatedly exposed to disturbance, and organic materials would have deteriorated even without human interference. A body placed in a wooden coffin, surrounded by textiles and offerings, could have suffered enormously from moisture, insects, decay, and later intrusion. Thousands of years of environmental and human activity can reduce a once elaborate burial to fragments. But another possibility is more intriguing. Could some royal bodies have been deliberately removed by ancient Egyptians themselves? Later, rulers sometimes had strong reasons to control the memory of earlier kings. A royal burial could be relocated for protection, ritual purposes, or political reasons. If a body was transferred elsewhere, the original tomb might remain as a symbolic monument even after its occupant had gone. There is also the possibility that some remains were destroyed so completely that no later relocation could preserve them. Fires, collapsing structures, repeated looting, and deliberate desecration may each have contributed to the disappearance. And yet, the absence of a body does not necessarily mean the absence of a royal presence. At Abydos, the tomb itself could have functioned as more than a container for physical remains. It may have been a sacred focus through which the dead king continued to exist ritually, regardless of where his body ultimately rested. That leaves an unsettling archaeological puzzle. Were the earliest kings buried elsewhere after their original tombs were disturbed? Were their remains gradually destroyed? Or are fragments of their identities still hidden within chambers that have yet to reveal everything they contain? At el-Kab, stone walls and empty burial chambers preserve the outline of a royal world, but the kings themselves remain frustratingly elusive. The sands of el-Kab preserve one of the earliest and most unsettling expressions of Egyptian kingship. Around the great mud-brick tombs of Egypt's first dynasty, archaeologists uncovered rows of smaller graves containing men and women who appear to have been deliberately placed beside their rulers. Their proximity to royal burials raises a haunting possibility that some people were expected to accompany a king into death. The practice is most clearly associated with the reigns of Egypt's earliest kings, particularly Hor-Aha, Deir, Djet, and Den, during the First Dynasty, around 3100 to 2900 BC. Their tombs at Abydos were surrounded by subsidiary burials arranged according to carefully planned layouts. At first, these graves were interpreted as evidence of retainer sacrifice, the deliberate killing of members of the royal household so they could continue serving their ruler in the afterlife. The idea seemed to fit the architecture. The subsidiary graves were positioned close to the royal tombs, often in organized rows or clusters. Many contained relatively modest burials, while some were associated with individuals who may have held specialized roles. Their placement suggested that the people inside them were connected to the royal institution, rather than being ordinary members of the surrounding population. But architecture alone cannot tell us whether they died willingly, naturally, or by force. For many years, the sacrifice interpretation was strengthened by comparisons with other early royal traditions. Ancient Mesopotamian sites, particularly the royal cemetery at Ur, provide evidence that people may have been killed and buried alongside high-status individuals. The existence of such practices elsewhere made the possibility of Egyptian retainer sacrifice seem plausible. Yet, Egyptian evidence presents an important complication. At the Abydos Royal Cemetery, many subsidiary graves contain no obvious signs of violent death. Skeletal remains are often incomplete or poorly preserved, and the early excavations did not always record the evidence with the precision expected today. Without clear trauma, determining the cause of death becomes extremely difficult. Another explanation gradually gained attention. Perhaps these were not victims at all. They may have been members of the royal household who died naturally around the same period as their king and were granted the extraordinary privilege of being buried near him. Their graves could represent loyalty and status rather than execution. In such a society, proximity to the king in death might have been an honor reserved for people of particular importance. But there is a problem with this interpretation too. The sheer number and organization of some subsidiary burials can make accidental clustering difficult to explain. At certain royal complexes, the graves appear to have been incorporated into the original funerary design. If so, the people may have been selected for burial alongside the king before their deaths. Then there is the question of purpose. What did the earliest Egyptians believe would happen to a royal household after death? Did the king require servants in another realm? Were these individuals understood as companions, attendants, guardians, or symbolic representatives of the living kingdom? Perhaps the graves were intended to recreate the structure of royal life beyond the grave, rather than simply provide personal burial places. Some researchers have also proposed that the practice changed rapidly. By the later First Dynasty and the beginning of the Second Dynasty, large-scale subsidiary burial around royal tombs appears to decline. In its place, Egyptian funerary culture increasingly relied on representations, offerings, inscriptions, and symbolic substitutes for living attendants. That transformation may be one of the most revealing clues. If people really were being sacrificed, why did the practice disappear? Had Egyptian religious ideas changed? Had royal power become expressed through different means? Or were the earlier burials misunderstood from the beginning? The graves around Egypt's first kings therefore remain suspended between several interpretations. They may preserve evidence of a brutal royal custom, an extraordinary funerary honor, or a ritual tradition whose meaning has been lost. The earth has preserved the arrangement of the graves remarkably well, but it has not preserved the final moments of the people inside them. And somewhere between sacrifice, service, and ceremony lies a story that archaeology has yet to fully recover. From the rocky landscape of Hierakonpolis, ancient Nehen, comes a glimpse into a time when Egypt had not yet become a unified kingdom. The cemetery known as HK43 lies near the settlement that flourished along the Nile more than 5,000 years ago. Its graves belong mainly to the Predynastic period, when regional communities were developing new forms of power, ritual, and social identity. Among the remains, however, archaeologists encountered evidence that some individuals met violent ends. HK43 dates primarily to the Naqada II period, roughly between 3700 and 3300 BC. The cemetery contained numerous burials, including adults and children, accompanied by pottery, ornaments, tools, and other objects. Most graves reflect ordinary mortuary practices of their time, but a smaller group of individuals displays evidence of severe physical trauma. Some injuries were concentrated on the skull and other parts of the skeleton, indicating powerful blows delivered around the time of death. In several cases, the trauma appears inconsistent with ordinary accidents. The evidence suggests episodes of interpersonal violence within a society that was becoming increasingly complex. But what caused these deaths? The most straightforward interpretation is conflict. Hierakonpolis was one of the most important centers of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, and its growing population may have competed with neighboring communities for farmland, water, trade routes, and political influence. Violence between rival groups could therefore have produced casualties that were eventually buried at HK43. The period itself was one of profound transformation. Across Upper Egypt, settlements were expanding, long-distance exchange was increasing, and powerful regional centers were emerging. Elite burials became more elaborate, while objects depicting weapons, warfare, and domination began appearing with greater frequency in the archaeological record. These developments do not prove that society was constantly at war, but they suggest that organized violence was becoming an increasingly recognizable feature of life. The remains from HK43 fit into this broader picture. Yet, the cemetery does not simply present a straightforward battlefield translated into graves. The injured individuals were buried within a community cemetery alongside people who appear to have died under very different circumstances. That raises another possibility. Perhaps the violence was episodic rather than continuous. Could a particular conflict have produced a sudden increase in deaths? Or might some of the injuries have resulted from disputes between individuals rather than large-scale warfare? Skeletal evidence can reveal the force and location of an injury, but it rarely identifies the person responsible. It also cannot always distinguish between a raid, a feud, an execution, or a chaotic episode of violence. The circumstances surrounding each death may therefore have been very different. There is another layer to consider. Some predynastic cemeteries contain evidence of bodies being manipulated after death. Burial customs could involve unusual positioning, disturbance, or later rearrangement of remains. In a society without written explanations for these practices, modern observers can easily interpret unfamiliar funerary treatment through the lens of violence. That makes careful analysis essential. A damaged skeleton is not automatically the victim of murder. Natural decomposition, burial pressure, animal activity, and later disturbance can alter human remains. But where trauma occurs at or near the time of death, the evidence becomes considerably harder to dismiss as the result of later processes. At HK43, that evidence offers a rare glimpse into the human cost of a society undergoing rapid change. Perhaps these people were casualties of local conflict. Perhaps they belonged to rival groups drawn into confrontation around Hierakonpolis. Or perhaps their deaths were connected to smaller acts of violence whose circumstances disappeared with the people who witnessed them. Whatever the explanation, their graves preserve something that official histories often overlook. The consequences of power before Egypt had fully become a unified state. Long before royal monuments dominated the Nile Valley, ordinary people were already experiencing the dangers that accompanied competition, authority, and social change. The bones of HK43 record the violence, but not its cause, and the silence surrounding those deaths leaves open the possibility that the cemetery still holds clues to conflicts we have yet to understand. From the dark interior of the Turin king list to the weathered stones of Saqqara, one name appears almost like a wound in Egypt's royal record: Hudjefa. Unlike famous pharaohs whose monuments preserve their achievements, Hudjefa survives largely as a peculiar entry in later king lists, a ruler surrounded by uncertainty, with almost no surviving evidence that clearly identifies him. The name itself is part of the mystery. Hudjefa is generally associated with Egypt's second dynasty, probably during the period around the late 27th century BC. His supposed reign appears in ancient king lists, including the Abydos king list and the Turin canon, but the surviving evidence is remarkably thin. There is no securely identified royal tomb, no confirmed statue, and no contemporary inscription that clearly establishes him as a historical king. Even more intriguing is the meaning traditionally associated with his name. The Egyptian term Hudjefa is often understood not as a personal name, but as something closer to lacuna, omitted, or missing. In other words, the word may have been inserted by a later scribe to indicate that the original royal name was no longer readable or known. That changes the entire mystery. Rather than being a pharaoh whose personal name was deliberately erased, Hudjefa may represent the absence of a name that had already disappeared from the historical record. Ancient scribes who copied older king lists sometimes encountered damaged or incomplete sources. If a royal name could not be recovered, a notation might have been used to indicate the gap. Over centuries, however, a notation could itself be mistaken for the name of a king. Could that be what happened to Hudjefa? The possibility is taken seriously by Egyptologists because the king lists were compiled long after the Second Dynasty. The Turin canon, for example, was written during the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the rulers it attempted to record. Its scribes were working from earlier traditions and documents, some of which had already suffered damage or loss. Yet the story becomes more complicated. Later sources place Hudjefa within a sequence of Second Dynasty rulers, suggesting that the tradition preserved at least some memory of a king occupying a specific position in the royal succession. Another ruler associated with this enigmatic period, Sneferka, is similarly difficult to connect with securely identified contemporary evidence. There may therefore have been real rulers behind these obscure entries, even if their monuments have not survived. One possibility is that Hudjefa belonged to a short-lived royal line whose physical remains were later dismantled, reused, or simply buried beneath later construction. Early Egyptian monuments were not always preserved intact. Stones could be quarried for later buildings, while mud brick structures gradually disappeared into the landscape. Another interpretation is more political. Perhaps later Egyptians intentionally minimized certain rulers whose reigns were considered insignificant, illegitimate, or troublesome. Royal lists were not always neutral historical records. They could reflect political memory, dynastic preferences, and changing ideas about which kings deserved recognition. But there is no direct evidence proving that Hudjefa himself was deliberately erased. That distinction is important. The dramatic image of a pharaoh condemned to oblivion is compelling, yet the surviving evidence points more cautiously toward a scribal problem, a missing name transformed into a mysterious royal entry. Still, even that mundane explanation leaves something remarkable behind. Somewhere between an ancient, damaged document and a later attempt to preserve Egypt's royal history, a gap became a king. And perhaps that is the true mystery of Hudjefa. Was he an actual ruler whose monuments have disappeared, a forgotten king whose memory was deliberately diminished, or simply a scribal mark that later generations misunderstood? The surviving lists preserve his place, but not his story. And until contemporary evidence emerges from the archaeological record, the man behind the missing name remains hidden in one of Egypt's most intriguing historical gaps. From the dry earth of Abydos comes a royal symbol so small that it could easily be overlooked. A simple bird sign incised onto fragments of pottery and stone. Yet, that image has become attached to one of the most elusive figures in Egypt's earliest history, a ruler known to modern scholars simply as King Bird. The name is not ancient Egyptian in the ordinary sense. Bird is a modern designation, created because the surviving royal sign resembles a bird and no secure reading of the ruler's actual name has been established. Somewhere during the First Dynasty, around the late 4th millennium BC, this enigmatic symbol appears to have represented a royal individual whose identity has almost completely disappeared. The evidence is sparse. Unlike Narmer, Hora-Ha, Deir, or Den, the supposed king bird has not left behind a clearly identified tomb or an extensive collection of monuments. His existence rests largely on isolated inscriptions and fragments associated with the earliest royal cemetery at Abydos. These markings have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of a previously unknown ruler who occupied a position within the developing Egyptian monarchy. But even that interpretation requires caution. The signs are extremely brief, and early Egyptian writing was still developing. A symbol that appears obvious to a modern observer may not necessarily represent a royal name. It could have identified a place, an object, a title, or another individual entirely. So, why connect the bird symbol with a king? The answer lies partly in its context. Some of the inscriptions were found in or near early royal burial areas, where other short inscriptions are known to record names and titles connected with Egypt's first rulers. Because of this setting, several Egyptologists have considered the possibility that the bird sign belonged to a ruler whose name has otherwise vanished. If that interpretation is correct, where would King Bird fit? Some researchers have suggested that he may have ruled shortly before or after one of the better-known First Dynasty kings. Such a position could explain why his presence is so faint. Perhaps his reign was brief, politically unstable, or later incorporated into the traditions surrounding another ruler. There is another possibility. The symbol might represent a king whose reign belonged to a period of political competition, when upper and lower Egyptian elites were still consolidating power. The emergence of the First Dynasty was not necessarily a single, uncomplicated transition. Several regional centers possessed their own traditions, symbols, and political authority. A ruler, known only from a few signs, could therefore represent a short-lived claim to kingship that later royal traditions chose not to emphasize. But the evidence does not allow us to go much further. There is no surviving royal biography explaining his achievements. No contemporary inscription clearly describes his campaigns, monuments, family, or death. Even the reading of the bird sign remains uncertain, and scholars continue to debate whether the supposed king represents a genuine historical ruler at all. More speculative interpretations sometimes imagine a forgotten dynasty or an overlooked rival to the kings traditionally credited with founding unified Egypt. Such ideas are difficult to prove, but they arise from a genuine problem. The archaeological record of Egypt's earliest monarchy is incomplete, and our modern lists inevitably create an illusion of certainty. A single fragment can therefore become remarkably important. If the bird really was a royal emblem, it may preserve the memory of a ruler whose monuments were destroyed, reused, or buried beneath later layers of occupation. If it was not a royal name, then the mystery becomes one of interpretation, a reminder of how easily an ambiguous symbol can acquire an identity thousands of years after it was carved. Perhaps King Bird was a forgotten pharaoh. Perhaps he was never a king at all. Somewhere between those possibilities lies an answer that the surviving fragments cannot yet provide. And until another inscription emerges from the ancient soil of Egypt, the little bird remains suspended in the shadows of the First Dynasty, a symbol waiting for a name. Not far from the modern town of Esna, on the western bank of the Nile, the archaeological site of Adaïma preserves the remains of a community that lived during one of the most transformative periods in Egyptian history. Its cemeteries contain thousands of years of funerary activity, but among the most intriguing evidence are graves that appear to have been deliberately disturbed, their contents displaced, and, in some cases, human remains subjected to unusual treatment. Adaïma flourished during the Predynastic period, particularly during the 4th millennium BC. Its inhabitants lived in settlements along the Nile, while Egyptian society was gradually moving toward greater political organization. The cemeteries reveal ordinary aspects of life: pottery, stone tools, ornaments, animal remains, and human burials, but they also preserve evidence of actions that occurred after some people had been placed in the ground. Several graves show signs of disturbance that cannot immediately be attributed to natural processes. Bodies were sometimes found with bones scattered from their original anatomical positions. In other cases, skulls or limbs had been displaced, while grave goods were moved or removed. Some human remains display traces consistent with intentional manipulation. The question is whether these actions were carried out by people soon after burial, long after decomposition, or by natural forces acting over centuries. The distinction is crucial. A grave can change dramatically without anyone deliberately reopening it. Decomposition separates joints. Animals can enter burial spaces, water can move smaller bones, and later burials may cut into earlier graves. Ancient cemeteries were living landscapes, repeatedly used by communities who may not have known exactly where earlier burials lay. At Adaïma, however, researchers have argued that some disturbances appear too organized to be explained entirely by these processes. One interpretation is that certain graves were deliberately reopened as part of mortuary rituals. In many prehistoric societies, death was not necessarily viewed as a single event. The body could pass through stages, with relatives returning to the burial site, moving remains, or altering the arrangement of bones as part of an ongoing relationship with the dead. Under this interpretation, destruction does not necessarily mean hostility. A dismembered skeleton might represent ritual transformation rather than punishment. The removal of particular bones could have carried symbolic significance, perhaps reflecting beliefs about the separation of the deceased from the living community. But another possibility is considerably darker. Some researchers have considered whether certain bodies at Adaïma suffered deliberate violence either around the time of death or shortly afterward. Evidence of trauma has been documented among pre-dynastic populations in the region, and the broader archaeological record shows that interpersonal conflict existed during this period. Yet, violence, post-mortem manipulation, and grave disturbance must be distinguished carefully. One does not automatically prove the others. Could some graves have been targeted by enemies? That possibility has been proposed in discussions of damaged pre-dynastic burials, particularly where remains appear intentionally disrupted. If rival groups desecrated graves, the destruction could have carried a social meaning, an attack on the memory or identity of an individual, rather than simply an attempt to recover valuables. There are also less dramatic explanations. Graves could have been disturbed by later inhabitants who reused the cemetery without fully understanding the original burial arrangements. Objects might have been removed for practical reasons, while human bones were accidentally displaced during new construction. What appears deliberate today may have resulted from repeated activity in a crowded funerary landscape. Adaïma therefore presents a difficult archaeological puzzle. Its disturbed graves exist at a moment when Egyptian society was developing new ideas about identity, status, and death. Written records are absent, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct intentions from soil layers, skeletal positions, injuries, and fragments of material culture. Perhaps these graves were intentionally transformed as part of funerary ceremonies. Perhaps some were violated by hostile groups, or perhaps centuries of natural and human activity gradually created patterns that only appear deliberate from the modern perspective. The evidence remains incomplete, and that uncertainty is what gives Adaïma its quiet sense of unease. The graves have preserved the physical traces of disturbance, but not the thoughts of the people who carried it out. What did they believe they were doing when they reopened those burials? And what might the untouched portions of the cemetery still reveal about the forgotten rituals surrounding death in pre-dynastic Egypt? From the pre-dynastic cemetery of Hierakonpolis comes an image that seems almost suspended between the human and the avian world. A small female figure with raised arms, an elongated body, and a face whose simplified form can resemble the head of a bird. These enigmatic figures are often called bird ladies, and they belong to one of the most elusive traditions of pre-dynastic Egyptian art. Their meaning, and their connection to the women buried alongside them, remains uncertain. Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekhen, was already an important center during the 4th millennium BC. Its elite cemetery, known as HK6, contains some of the earliest evidence for monumental funerary architecture, elaborate animal burials, and powerful regional leaders. Excavations have revealed that the cemetery was not simply a collection of graves. It was a carefully organized landscape in which status, ritual, animals, architecture, and human burial were closely connected. Within this world appear the enigmatic female figurines with bird-like heads. Their bodies are unmistakably human. They have breasts, waists, arms, and legs, yet their heads can be reduced to narrow, beak-like forms. Their arms are often raised beside the head, with the hands turned inward. Some examples were painted, while others were modeled from clay or Nile silt. Their simplified appearance makes them difficult to interpret through later Egyptian religious traditions. And this is where the mystery begins. Were these representations of actual women, supernatural beings, fertility figures, dancers, mourners, or deities. Archaeologists have proposed all of these possibilities at different times, but there is no surviving inscription telling us what the makers intended. Even the assumption that the figures are truly bird-headed remains open to interpretation. What looks like a beak to modern eyes could be an exaggerated human nose or a symbolic feature whose meaning has disappeared. The connection with burial makes the question even more intriguing. Bird-headed female figurines are frequently associated with predynastic funerary contexts. Some have been interpreted as companions for the deceased, perhaps representing fertility, sexuality, regeneration, or supernatural protection. Others have been linked to ritual performers or mourners. But these interpretations remain hypotheses rather than established facts. At Hierakonpolis, the wider cemetery provides an important setting for understanding this imagery. The elite cemetery of HK6 contains human tombs accompanied by remarkable animal burials: wild cattle, baboons, leopards, dogs, sheep, goats, and other creatures. Researchers have suggested that these animals may have represented power, protection, companionship, food, or symbolic control over forces of the natural world. Could the bird-like women have served a related purpose? Perhaps. Birds held an important place in the symbolic world developing along the Nile. Their ability to move between earth and sky may have made them powerful images of transition, while specific birds later became associated with kingship and divinity. But projecting fully developed dynastic beliefs backward into the pre-dynastic period is dangerous. The symbolism was still evolving, and local traditions could differ considerably. There is another possibility worth considering. Perhaps these figures were not intended to represent supernatural beings at all. Their unusual faces may have been a stylized artistic convention used to emphasize a particular role or ritual identity. The raised arms themselves could carry meaning, possibly connected with dancing, lamentation, celebration, or ceremonial gestures. Similar poses appear in pre-dynastic imagery, suggesting that the gesture may have been more important than the facial form. The mystery becomes even deeper because some of the most famous bird lady examples were not recovered from carefully documented archaeological contexts. A significant group came from el-Bahari, near Hierakonpolis, and the history of collecting and forgery surrounding these figurines has complicated attempts to establish their original distribution. The Hierakonpolis expedition itself notes that scientifically excavated examples are comparatively scarce, making it difficult to determine how widespread this style actually was. That uncertainty leaves the unidentified women of this tradition suspended between archaeology and interpretation. Were they representations of fertility and renewal? Ritual dancers frozen in clay? Protective beings associated with the dead? Or perhaps images of a religious concept that disappeared before Egypt developed the written mythology familiar from later centuries? Even the name Bird Lady is modern, a convenient label rather than an ancient title. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part. These figures survived thousands of years, yet the meaning they once carried did not survive with them. Their raised arms still suggest movement, their unusual faces still resist easy classification, and their association with burial keeps open the possibility that they belong to beliefs surrounding death and transformation. Somewhere in the cemeteries of pre-dynastic Hierakonpolis, there may still be another figurine, another burial, or another fragment of evidence capable of changing the interpretation entirely. Until then, the woman behind the bird lady remains unknown, not because she left no trace, but because the surviving traces speak in a symbolic language we have only partly learned to read. The trail leads deeper into Egypt's earliest ideas about kingship, to a time when the boundary between divine tradition and human history had not yet been clearly separated. In later Egyptian records, a mysterious expression appears: the followers of Horus, or Shemsu-Hor. The phrase is associated with the distant age before the established dynasties, yet its precise meaning remains uncertain. Horus himself was central to Egyptian royal ideology. Usually represented as a falcon or a falcon-headed figure, he became closely associated with legitimate kingship. The living pharaoh was connected with Horus, while the deceased ruler was linked with Osiris. This relationship allowed Egyptian kingship to be presented not merely as political authority, but as part of a sacred order extending back into primordial time. Within this framework, the followers of Horus occupy an unusual position. Later, Egyptian traditions describe divine and semi-divine rulers who supposedly governed Egypt before the reign of human kings. The Shemsu-Hor are sometimes placed within this legendary succession. But the surviving sources do not provide the kind of evidence that would allow historians to identify them as a conventional political dynasty. There are no securely identified palaces belonging to them, no royal cemetery bearing their collective name, and no contemporary inscription describing their activities as an organized historical group. So, what were the Egyptians remembering? One possibility is that the followers of Horus represent a symbolic category rather than a literal population. The phrase may have referred to ancestral rulers, divine companions, or mythological beings connected with the origins of kingship. Ancient Egyptian traditions frequently merged political history with sacred genealogy, allowing rulers of the distant past to become part of a cosmic narrative. Another interpretation is more historical. Perhaps the expression preserved a distant memory of early regional elites who existed before Egypt became a unified kingdom. During the 4th millennium BC, the Nile Valley contained several important cultural centers, including Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Nakada. These communities developed their own political identities, religious practices, and systems of authority. Over generations, their traditions could have been reorganized into a single national story. If Horus became the divine ancestor of Egyptian kingship, then earlier rulers associated with his cult might later have been remembered collectively as his followers. In this interpretation, the phrase could preserve a faint memory of real political groups whose original identities had disappeared. There is another clue in the language itself. The Egyptian word Shemsu can carry the sense of following, accompanying, or attending. It does not necessarily imply a secret order or an independent civilization. The expression could therefore describe those who followed Horus in a religious or royal context rather than people belonging to a mysterious institution. Still, the phrase has attracted much more dramatic interpretations. Some fringe theories have treated the followers of Horus as evidence for a forgotten civilization that existed thousands of years before the First Dynasty. Others have proposed that they were technologically advanced outsiders, visitors from elsewhere, or remnants of a civilization destroyed by a prehistoric catastrophe. These ideas are popular because Egyptian king lists sometimes appear to preserve enormous spans of time. But the chronology of these traditions is difficult to interpret literally. Egyptian texts often used mythological time to describe the remote beginnings of the world and the establishment of divine order. A sequence extending into impossibly distant ages does not necessarily function as a conventional historical timeline. The archaeological record provides an important counterweight. There is no accepted material evidence for an advanced prehistoric civilization corresponding to the legendary followers of Horus. What archaeology does reveal is a gradual development of complex societies in the Nile Valley, followed by increasing centralization and eventually the formation of the Egyptian state around the end of the 4th millennium BC. Yet, gradual development does not eliminate every mystery. The earliest phases of Egyptian civilization remain incompletely understood. Political alliances, migrations, religious transformations, and regional conflicts left traces that are difficult to reconstruct. Written records become abundant only after the Egyptian state was already established, meaning that much of the preceding history must be inferred from graves, settlements, pottery, tools, symbols, and monumental art. Perhaps the followers of Horus belong somewhere within that missing landscape. They may have been ancestral rulers whose names were forgotten. They may have represented a priestly or royal tradition centered on Horus. They may have been a mythological community created to bridge the gap between divine time and human kingship. Or they could preserve fragments of several older traditions that were gradually combined into one story. What makes the subject compelling is not the absence of evidence alone, but the way Egyptian memory transformed the distant past. By placing Horus and his followers before the human dynasties, Egyptian tradition created a bridge between the sacred world and the historical kingdom. The pharaoh did not simply inherit a throne. He entered a chain of authority believed to reach back toward the earliest order of creation. And somewhere within that chain, the followers of Horus remain suspended between myth and memory. Were they a poetic expression of divine kingship, a distorted recollection of Egypt's earliest rulers, or a collective name for people whose original identity has been completely lost? The surviving texts preserve the phrase, but not the people behind it. And until archaeology can connect those ancient words to tangible evidence, the followers of Horus remain one of Egypt's most intriguing shadows at the edge of recorded history. The low mounds of Tel el-Daba rise from the fertile landscape of Egypt's eastern delta, where ancient Avaris once stood as a major center of trade, migration, and political power. Beneath this landscape, archaeologists uncovered cemeteries containing people whose lives appear to have connected Egypt with distant regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Among them are individuals whose origins remain difficult to determine, raising a quiet but persistent question about who these foreign dead were and why they were buried at Avaris. Tel el-Daba flourished particularly during the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos established their capital at Avaris. From roughly the 17th to 16th centuries BC, the settlement became a cosmopolitan center, drawing people from different parts of the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Archaeological evidence includes imported pottery, architectural traditions, seals, weapons, and other objects demonstrating extensive cultural connections. The human remains provide another layer of evidence. Several cemeteries at the site contain individuals whose biological origins appear different from those of the surrounding Egyptian population. Researchers have used skeletal analysis, dental evidence, and increasingly sophisticated isotopic techniques to investigate where these people may have spent their childhoods. The results suggest that Avaris was not simply an Egyptian city inhabited by one uniform population. Some individuals appear to have originated locally, while others may have grown up outside the Nile Delta. Their possible places of origin include regions associated with the Levant and other areas of the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, determining an individual's birthplace thousands of years after death is rarely straightforward. Isotopes can provide clues about childhood environments, but they do not always identify a precise hometown. Human mobility was already common in the ancient Mediterranean, and people could move repeatedly during their lives. A person buried at Avaris might have been born elsewhere, raised in Egypt, married into a local family, or traveled between several communities. That uncertainty becomes especially interesting when the graves are examined alongside the archaeological evidence. Avaris was positioned near routes linking Egypt with the Sinai, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. Merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, administrators, migrants, and diplomats could all have passed through the city. Foreign communities may have lived there for generations, gradually adopting Egyptian customs while retaining elements of their original traditions. The dead, therefore, cannot always be placed neatly into categories such as Egyptian or foreigner. Some burials appear to follow Egyptian practices. Others contain objects or arrangements that suggest connections with traditions outside the Nile Valley. This mixture may reflect a population in which cultural identities were constantly changing. There is also evidence that some people may have arrived under circumstances connected with conflict. The Hyksos period was politically turbulent. Avaris became the center of a powerful kingdom that controlled much of northern Egypt before the rulers of Thebes eventually expelled the Hyksos and reunified the country. Foreign-born individuals found in the settlement could therefore have included soldiers, captives, political migrants, or members of elite households. But the evidence does not allow every foreign individual to be assigned such a dramatic role. A person from the Levant might have been a merchant. Another could have been born into a migrant family already established in Avaris. Someone else may have entered Egypt through marriage. Human mobility was not necessarily connected with warfare. This is where the cemetery becomes particularly revealing. Burials can preserve aspects of identity that architecture and political records cannot. The objects placed with the dead, the orientation of the body, the treatment of the skeleton, and the location of the grave can all offer clues about how a community understood its members. At Avaris, those clues sometimes point in different directions. A person could have biological connections to one region while participating fully in Egyptian cultural practices. Another might display foreign traditions while living within an Egyptian political environment. Identity was not necessarily fixed to birthplace. More speculative interpretations have imagined some of the unidentified dead as victims of warfare. Prisoners transported from distant lands, or members of foreign groups whose presence at Avaris has been underestimated. Such possibilities cannot simply be ruled out, but neither can they be established from foreign ancestry alone. The archaeological record is more subtle. It suggests a city where populations mixed, traditions overlapped, and people moved across political boundaries. The foreign dead at Tel el-Daba may therefore represent not a single mysterious group, but many individual stories compressed into one cemetery. Who were they before they arrived at Avaris? What languages did they speak? Did they consider themselves Egyptians, foreigners, or something in between? And when they were buried, did their families see them as outsiders, or simply as members of the community they had come to call home? The graves cannot answer every question. Yet, modern scientific analysis continues to extract new information from bones and teeth that once seemed silent. Perhaps future discoveries will identify the regions from which more of these people came, reveal how they moved through the ancient Mediterranean, and clarify why some ultimately ended their journeys at Avaris. For now, the cemetery preserves a portrait of ancient Egypt that is more interconnected than the traditional image suggests. Among the mudbrick ruins of Tel el-Daba, the dead came from different horizons, lived alongside one another, and left behind identities that remain only partially visible. Their origins may still be hidden in the smallest traces of bone, tooth, and soil, waiting for another discovery to bring their forgotten journeys into focus. The landscape around ancient Hierakonpolis, or Nekhen, is marked by low desert ridges, dry wadis, and the remains of one of Upper Egypt's most important predynastic centers. Among its most intriguing features are large mudbrick funerary structures that stand apart from the ordinary graves of the surrounding cemeteries. They belong to a period when Egyptian kingship was still taking shape, and their original owners remain difficult to identify. Hierakonpolis flourished during the 4th millennium BC, particularly during the Naqada II and early Naqada III periods. By this time, the settlement had become an important political and ceremonial center. Excavations have uncovered evidence of specialized craft production, long-distance exchange, ritual activity, elite burials, and monumental construction. The most remarkable evidence comes from the elite cemetery known as HK6. Here, archaeologists discovered large tombs surrounded by substantial mudbrick architecture, sometimes accompanied by animal burials and elaborate installations. These structures were far more imposing than ordinary pre-dynastic graves. Their scale suggests that the individuals associated with them possessed considerable authority, wealth, or symbolic importance. But who were they? That question is more difficult than it first appears. Hierakonpolis predates the fully established Egyptian monarchy. The rulers who commissioned these monuments did not leave behind the extensive inscriptions that later pharaohs would use to identify themselves. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct their status from architecture, grave goods, human remains, animal burials, and scattered symbolic evidence. One of the most famous structures in the cemetery is Tomb 16, sometimes called the Painted Tomb because of the unusual decorated surfaces discovered within it. Although badly damaged, the tomb provides evidence for an elite burial tradition involving imagery and objects that reveal connections across the pre-dynastic Nile Valley. Other large tombs contain equally intriguing combinations of human and animal remains. Wild cattle, baboons, dogs, sheep, goats, and other creatures were deliberately buried within the elite cemetery. Their presence suggests that animals were not merely food offerings. They may have represented power, protection, companionship, or particular relationships between elite individuals and the natural world. The architecture itself also raises questions. Some tombs were surrounded by wooden structures, enclosure walls, or subsidiary installations. In several cases, later activity disturbed the original arrangement, making reconstruction difficult. Yet, the overall pattern suggests that these were not isolated graves. They were places where communities returned repeatedly to perform rituals and commemorate important individuals. Could these tombs have belonged to early rulers? That is one of the most reasonable interpretations. Hierakonpolis was one of the major centers involved in the political developments that preceded the formation of the Egyptian state. It is therefore possible that some of the elite buried at HK6 were regional rulers whose authority contributed to the emergence of dynastic kingship. But calling them kings requires caution. The evidence does not provide a continuous royal sequence comparable to later dynasties. These individuals may instead have been chiefs, religious authorities, hereditary elites, or members of powerful families whose influence extended over a substantial territory. The distinction matters because the formation of Egypt was probably not an instantaneous event. Political power appears to have developed through competition, alliances, exchange, and gradual consolidation among several regional centers. Hierakonpolis may have been one of the places where that process unfolded. There are clues pointing toward connections beyond the immediate region. Objects recovered from elite contexts indicate long-distance exchange networks reaching into other parts of the Nile Valley and beyond. Such connections could have brought exotic materials, animals, ideas, and prestige goods to Hierakonpolis, strengthening the authority of local elites. Yet, the identity of the people buried in these monumental tombs remains elusive. Some tombs were robbed or disturbed in antiquity. Organic materials deteriorated. Human remains were often incomplete. In several cases, later activities altered the structures, leaving archaeologists with fragments rather than complete funerary assemblages. This creates a frustrating paradox. The people powerful enough to command monumental construction left behind some of the largest physical traces of their society, yet their names and biographies have largely disappeared. There are more speculative possibilities. Some have suggested that these tombs could belong to a previously unrecognized dynasty, or to rulers whose traditions were later absorbed into the mythology of the first dynasty. Others have imagined that Hierakonpolis was the seat of a political system that rivaled the emerging kingdom farther north. There is no secure evidence for a hidden dynasty in the dramatic sense, but the broader question is legitimate. How many powerful pre-dynastic figures existed whose identities were never preserved in later royal histories? The answer may be impossible to determine. What is clear is that Hierakonpolis was already capable of monumental funerary expression before Egypt's dynastic system was fully established. Its elite cemetery reveals a society with the resources to mobilize labor, control valuable materials, organize ritual spaces, and invest heavily in the memory of particular individuals. Yet, those individuals remain nameless. Perhaps their identities were once known to every inhabitant of Hierakonpolis. Perhaps their names were recorded on objects that have not survived. Or perhaps later Egyptian history simply selected a small number of rulers to remember, while countless others faded from the record. The giant mud-brick tombs remain, even when their owners do not. Their walls, burial chambers, animal graves, and scattered artifacts preserve the outline of people who once commanded extraordinary attention. But the final question remains suspended over the cemetery. Who were these powerful figures, and how much of Egypt's earliest political history is still concealed beneath the desert around Hierakonpolis? From the shadowed galleries of Saqqara to the fragments of ancient vessels preserved in museum collections, a royal name appears briefly and then seems to dissolve back into the uncertainty of Egypt's earliest dynastic history: Sneferka. He is associated with the end of the first dynasty, yet almost everything about him remains disputed: his reign, his position in the royal succession, and even whether he ruled Egypt as an independent king at all. Sneferka is known primarily from a small number of inscriptions on stone vessels. One of the most important examples was discovered in the tomb of Merikare at Abydos, where royal names from Egypt's earliest dynasties were recorded on objects deposited within the funerary complex. Other fragments bearing the name have been connected with the royal cemetery at Saqqara. The name itself is generally read as Sneferka, although the interpretation of the signs has been debated. Unlike later pharaohs, Sneferka left no extensive monuments proclaiming his achievements. There is no securely identified pyramid, temple, or large royal tomb that can confidently be assigned to him. This creates an immediate problem. If Sneferka was genuinely a king, where does he belong in the succession? The conventional sequence of late First Dynasty rulers includes figures such as Den, Anejib, Semerkhet, and Ka'a. Sneferka does not fit comfortably into that sequence. His name appears in archaeological contexts, but the evidence is too sparse to establish a secure reign. One possibility is that Sneferka was a very short-lived ruler who governed during a period of instability near the end of the dynasty. If his reign lasted only briefly, the lack of monumental construction would not be surprising. A ruler who controlled Egypt for months or a few years might have had little opportunity to establish a substantial architectural legacy. Another possibility is that Sneferka was a rival claimant. The transition between the first and second dynasties may not have been completely peaceful. Ancient Egyptian king lists present royal succession in an orderly manner, but archaeological evidence can suggest a more complicated political landscape. Competing factions may have existed, particularly when the legitimacy of a ruler was contested. Could Sneferka have been one of those forgotten claimants? There is no direct evidence proving it, but the possibility has attracted scholarly attention because several obscure royal names appear around the same period. Some may represent brief reigns, regional rulers, alternative names for better-known kings, or later scribal traditions that became detached from their original context. Another complication comes from the material itself. Early dynastic vessel inscriptions were often extremely brief. A royal name could appear without a biography, title, date, or explanation of where the object had originally been used. When a fragment survives outside its original context, its historical meaning becomes even harder to reconstruct. The name may tell us that Sneferka existed within a royal tradition. It does not necessarily tell us how much territory he controlled. Some researchers have proposed that Sneferka might have been connected with the final phase of the First Dynasty at Saqqara, perhaps representing a ruler whose authority was centered in northern Egypt. Others have suggested that the name could belong to an otherwise unknown king whose reign was later excluded from standard royal traditions. There are even more speculative interpretations. Some have attempted to connect Sneferka with a political crisis involving rival claimants and changing royal centers. If Egypt's early state was still balancing regional interests, a disputed succession could have produced competing kings whose names were later compressed or omitted from official historical memory. But the evidence remains too fragmentary to establish such a scenario. What can be said with greater confidence is that Sneferka occupies a genuine archaeological problem. His name exists, yet his historical identity remains incomplete. The material evidence is sufficient to prevent him from being dismissed as pure invention, but insufficient to reconstruct his reign with confidence. Perhaps his disappearance from history was simply the consequence of brevity. A short reign can leave a remarkably small footprint. Perhaps, later, royal traditions had little reason to preserve the memory of a politically unsuccessful predecessor. Royal history was never merely a neutral record. Later dynasties had their own reasons for emphasizing certain rulers and minimizing others. Or perhaps Sneferka belonged to a moment of political competition that the surviving records have reduced to a handful of inscriptions. The fragments offer no final answer. They preserve a name without a story, a possible king without a securely identified kingdom, and a ruler who may have stood at one of the most uncertain transitions in Egypt's earliest monarchy. Somewhere beneath the sands of Abydos or Saqqara, another vessel fragment or burial context may still exist that could change the picture entirely. Until such evidence emerges, Sneferka remains suspended between the known and the forgotten, a royal name preserved just enough to prove that something once stood behind it, but not enough to tell us who that ruler truly was, how he came to power, or why his memory almost disappeared from Egypt's historical record. In the quiet halls of the Museo Archeologico Regionale in Palermo, a dark fragment of polished stone preserves one of Egypt's most unusual historical records. The Palermo stone is broken, weathered, and incomplete, yet its surviving inscriptions reach deep into Egypt's remote past. Alongside recognizable kings are references to rulers whose names belong to a period before the established dynasties, figures who occupy an uncertain space between mythology and history. The stone itself is a fragment of a larger royal annal, probably created during Egypt's 5th dynasty, around the 25th century BC. Its inscriptions record royal events year by year, including ceremonies, military activities, religious offerings, taxation, and remarkable natural occurrences. But the earliest section is particularly intriguing because it preserves a sequence of rulers said to have governed Egypt before the traditional First Dynasty. These are the so-called followers of Horus, and the divine rulers who preceded human kings. The Palermo stone does not provide the kind of narrative biography modern readers might expect. Instead, it preserves names and chronological entries within a formal royal framework. Some of the earliest rulers are presented as divine beings, while later entries move toward recognizable human kings. This creates an important historical problem. Were these early rulers intended to represent actual people remembered from Egypt's distant past, or were they part of a sacred chronology that was never meant to function as ordinary history? Mainstream Egyptology generally treats these figures cautiously. Egyptian royal ideology often connected the reigning king with the gods and placed the monarchy within a cosmic order extending back to creation. Recording divine rulers before human dynasties could therefore have served a religious and ideological purpose. Yet, the Palermo stone may also preserve fragments of genuine historical memory. Egypt's state emerged through a long process of regional consolidation. Before political unification, the Nile Valley contained several powerful centers with their own elites, traditions, and territorial interests. Some early rulers may have governed substantial regions without becoming part of the later dynastic sequence. If so, later Egyptian scribes may have transformed memories of these early authorities into a more coherent tradition. The difficulty is separating historical memory from theological symbolism. The earliest section of the royal annals is fragmentary, and much of the original stone has disappeared. We do not possess the complete text. Other fragments are known, including pieces preserved in Cairo and elsewhere, but they do not reconstruct every missing line. That means the record we have today is only a surviving portion of a much larger document. Among its lost sections could have been names, dates, or details that would clarify the identities of these mysterious rulers. Instead, historians are forced to work with fragments separated by thousands of years of history. The chronology itself can also be misleading if interpreted too literally. Later, Egyptian tradition sometimes described enormous spans of time between the creation of the world and the beginning of human dynasties. Such numbers are often connected with mythological concepts rather than conventional historical dating. This is one reason scholars generally do not interpret the Palermo stone as evidence for a civilization of impossible antiquity. Still, the existence of the tradition is significant. It shows that Egyptians of the 5th dynasty believed the monarchy had a history extending far beyond the kings they could directly document. They were preserving a memory of origins, a sequence of rulers, divine figures, and ancestors that gave legitimacy to the institution of kingship. Could some of those names conceal real rulers? Possibly. A regional chief remembered generations later might have become a semi-divine ancestor. A powerful dynasty could have been absorbed into a mythological genealogy. Alternatively, entirely symbolic figures may have been created to represent stages in the establishment of cosmic and political order. There are also more speculative interpretations. Some fringe writers have treated the pre-dynastic rulers as evidence of a highly advanced civilization that supposedly existed long before conventional Egyptian chronology. Others have connected the tradition with catastrophic events or external visitors. These ideas are not supported by accepted archaeological evidence, but they persist partly because the earliest Egyptian traditions contain genuine gaps and ambiguities. The archaeological record, however, tells a more gradual story. Sites such as Hierakonpolis, Abydos, Nakada, and other pre-dynastic centers reveal increasing social complexity, specialized production, long-distance exchange, elite burials, and growing political authority. These developments provide a plausible background for the emergence of dynastic Egypt without requiring a forgotten civilization of unknown technological origin. And yet, the Palermo stone still preserves something difficult to ignore. It is a record created by people who were already looking backward. They knew that their own kingdom had predecessors, even if those predecessors were remembered through a mixture of history, ritual, and mythology. The missing names may have belonged to rulers whose monuments disappeared long before the stone was carved, or they may have been figures who never existed as historical individuals at all. The stone cannot tell us which interpretation is correct. Its broken surface leaves the past interrupted. with entire portions of the record lost between surviving lines. Somewhere within those missing sections may have been the identities of rulers who once held power along the Nile, or perhaps explanations for traditions that later generations preserved only as sacred memory. For now, the Palermo stone offers neither a clear list of forgotten kings nor a simple myth. It offers fragments, a glimpse of how ancient Egyptians themselves remembered the beginnings of their civilization. And when the missing pieces are considered, one question remains quietly unresolved. How much of Egypt's earliest political history disappeared before anyone had the chance to record it permanently? The desert at el-Kab is almost silent today, but beneath its pale surface lies one of Egypt's earliest royal cemeteries. Among the monumental tombs of the first kings are traces of animals that occupied an unexpected place in the funerary landscape. Donkeys. Their burials are among the earliest evidence that these working animals could carry a symbolic significance extending far beyond ordinary labor. The discovery is particularly important because the donkeys were associated with elite funerary contexts at Abydos during the First Dynasty, around the late 4th millennium BC. Their presence reveals something about transportation, status, and the organization of early Egyptian society, but exactly why they were buried beside royal and elite tombs remains open to interpretation. Donkeys were essential animals in the ancient Near East. They could carry loads across difficult terrain, travel long distances, and survive in environments where larger animals were less practical. In early Egypt, they would have been valuable for moving goods, agricultural products, and people. But burying an animal requires something more than practical usefulness. At Abydos, archaeologists identified donkey remains in subsidiary areas associated with elite funerary complexes. The animals were not simply discarded carcasses. Their placement suggests deliberate burial, raising the possibility that they had a special relationship with the people whose tombs they accompanied. One straightforward interpretation is transportation. Perhaps the donkeys were buried because they had served the deceased during life and were considered part of the individual's household or entourage. In a society where the ability to transport goods over long distances was closely connected with wealth and political power, an animal associated with travel could have represented an important aspect of elite identity. But there may have been a deeper meaning. The earliest Egyptian elite tombs were not merely places where bodies were stored. They were carefully constructed environments intended to sustain the deceased through an afterlife. Food, tools, vessels, ornaments, animals, and other objects could be placed nearby because they were believed to have continued usefulness beyond death. Could the donkeys have been intended to serve the deceased in the next world? It is possible, although direct evidence for this specific belief at Abydos is limited. The animals may instead have symbolized mobility, trade, or access to distant regions. The donkey was one of the most important means of transportation in early desert and trade networks. To possess several animals capable of carrying valuable goods could have been a visible expression of wealth and influence. There is another possibility. The donkeys may have been connected with ritual activity surrounding the tomb itself. Their burial could have marked the completion of a funerary ceremony, perhaps representing the transfer of the deceased from the world of the living into a sacred realm. Without written descriptions from this early period, however, the precise ritual meaning remains difficult to reconstruct. The context becomes more intriguing when the broader Abydos cemetery is considered. The first dynasty royal tombs were surrounded by subsidiary burials, storage chambers, and structures that appear to have been deliberately incorporated into the royal funerary complexes. Humans, animals, objects, and architecture formed part of a single ceremonial landscape. The donkeys, therefore, may not have been isolated curiosities. They could have belonged to a larger system in which everything surrounding the royal tomb expressed the organization of earthly life. Servants, livestock, equipment, food, and symbols of authority may all have been incorporated into a carefully planned environment designed to preserve the king's status after death. Yet one question remains particularly difficult. Were these animals killed specifically for the funeral, or had they died naturally and later received an honored burial? Animal bones alone cannot always answer that question. If there is no clear evidence of trauma associated with the moment of death, deliberate sacrifice becomes difficult to establish. An animal could have died naturally after years of service and then been buried because of its connection with an important household. This distinction matters. The dramatic image of animals sacrificed to accompany a ruler is compelling, but archaeology demands stronger evidence before such a conclusion can be accepted. The donkey burials may instead represent a more subtle relationship between humans and animals, one in which working animals became symbols of status, loyalty, and continuity. Animals, one in which working animals became symbols of status, loyalty, and continuity. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested that donkeys held a religious significance connected with desert travel or supernatural forces. Later, Egyptian traditions sometimes associated donkeys with particular deities and negative symbolism, but projecting those much later beliefs onto First Dynasty burials would be difficult to justify. The evidence belongs to an earlier world. At this stage of Egyptian history, religious traditions were still developing, and the symbolic meanings attached to animals could vary from one region to another. The donkeys of Abydos may therefore have carried meanings that disappeared before Egyptian writing began recording funerary beliefs in detail. What remains is their deliberate presence. They were working animals placed within one of the most important sacred landscapes of early Egypt. Their graves suggest that the boundary between practical usefulness and ritual significance was not always clear. An animal could transport goods during life and perhaps acquire another role in death. Were these donkeys servants of the living, companions of the dead, symbols of elite power, or participants in rituals whose meaning has been lost? The sand around Abydos has preserved their bones for thousands of years, but not the words spoken when they were buried. And as researchers continue to reconstruct the earliest royal cemeteries, these quiet animal graves may still hold clues to how Egypt's first elites understood wealth, travel, loyalty, and the mysterious transition from life into death. The story of Egypt's earliest kings is filled with names that appear only briefly before disappearing into the archaeological record. Among them is a ruler known as Ba, or Horus Ba, a figure whose identity, date, and place within the royal succession remain deeply uncertain. A few fragments preserve his name, but the evidence is so limited that even his dynasty has been debated. One important piece of evidence comes from Saqqara. A small, green schist fragment bearing a royal serech was found in the underground galleries associated with the step pyramid of Djoser. Another attestation of the name occurs in the tomb of the 6th dynasty official, Nai-Ankh-Ba. These later pieces preserve a royal name that may refer to the same obscure ruler, although the exact identification remains debated. The name itself is usually read as Ba, but even here, caution is necessary. The hieroglyphic sign connected with the name has generated different interpretations, and scholars have not reached universal agreement about precisely how the evidence should be understood. This uncertainty becomes even more striking when chronology enters the picture. Ba has been assigned, at different times, to the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd dynasty. Some Egyptologists have proposed that he belonged near the end of the 1st dynasty, possibly around the transition between the 1st and 2nd dynasties. Others have placed him later, within the 2nd dynasty. Still, another interpretation connects him with the early 3rd dynasty. There is no securely established reign length or chronological position. Why can one king be moved across several generations of Egyptian history? The answer lies in the extraordinary scarcity of evidence. Unlike rulers such as Djoser or Kasekemwi, Ba left no securely identified monumental complex that can anchor his reign. His burial place is unknown, and the surviving inscriptions provide little information beyond the royal name itself. Without a tomb, dated architectural context, or substantial contemporary inscription, chronology becomes a matter of comparing isolated pieces of evidence. One particularly intriguing possibility links Ba with the enigmatic ruler sometimes called Horus bird. A royal serek showing an indistinct bird was found at Abydos in the tomb of King Ka, and another example was discovered on a vessel fragment from the Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara. Because the bird is drawn without enough detail to identify it confidently, its reading remains uncertain. Some scholars, including Jaroslav Cherny and Peter Kaplony, propose that the bird sign could represent the same name, Ba. If that identification were correct, Horus Bird and Horus Ba would not be two rulers, but one elusive king. Yet, this interpretation is not universally accepted. Other researchers have argued that the two signs should remain separate. The bird may represent a different royal name, while Ba belongs to another period entirely. Some scholars have even suggested that Ba should be placed within the Third Dynasty rather than the turbulent transition between Egypt's first two dynasties. And this is where the mystery becomes particularly revealing. The problem may not be that Egypt forgot a famous king. It may be that modern historians are trying to assemble a single biography from fragments that originally belonged to different individuals. Imagine the archaeological record as a damaged manuscript. One fragment contains a royal emblem. Another preserves a similar sign centuries later. A third appears in a context associated with a different ruler. The temptation is to connect them into one story, but each connection carries assumptions. Perhaps Ba was a genuine king who ruled briefly during a politically unstable period. If he belonged near the end of the First Dynasty, he may have emerged during a succession crisis following Ka or another late First Dynasty ruler. Such a scenario would help explain why his archaeological footprint is so small. A short-lived claimant could have possessed royal authority without having enough time to establish a major building program. Another possibility is that Ba belonged to the Second Dynasty, a period already known for gaps and uncertainties in the royal sequence. The Second Dynasty's political history is considerably less clear than that of later periods, and several rulers are known from only a handful of inscriptions. There is also a more radical scholarly possibility that Ba was actually a Third Dynasty ruler whose surviving evidence was later misunderstood or assigned to the wrong period. This interpretation has been proposed because some of the archaeological material associated with the name may fit a later chronological setting better than the early dynastic transition. The mystery, therefore, does not necessarily concern a king who was deliberately erased. It may concern a king whose surviving evidence became detached from its original context. More speculative interpretations have imagined Ba as a forgotten rival who briefly challenged another royal house, perhaps ruling a portion of Egypt, while another king controlled the rest. Such political fragmentation is conceivable in Egypt's formative periods, but there is not enough evidence to establish it confidently. What can be established is far more modest, and perhaps more fascinating. A royal name existed. It was preserved on archaeological objects, yet the historical identity behind it remains uncertain. We do not know precisely when Ba ruled, where his court was located, how long his authority lasted, or where he was buried. Perhaps another inscription lies beneath the sands of Saqqara. Perhaps an undiscovered tomb will eventually reveal a royal burial that can finally anchor the name in time. Until then, Ba remains one of those rare figures who occupy the narrow space between evidence and interpretation. A few signs preserve the possibility of a king, while the absence of everything else keeps his story unresolved. Was Ba a forgotten ruler of the first dynasty, a shadowy king of the second, a later monarch of the third, or the same individual once labeled Horus Bird? The fragments do not yet agree, and somewhere in that disagreement, the identity of Ba remains hidden. The trail from Egypt's obscure rulers leads naturally toward a period when the kingdom itself seemed divided against its own reflection. In the fields surrounding ancient Hierakonpolis Magna, the landscape is quieter than the history that unfolded there. Mudbrick ruins, scattered cemetery remains, and low rises of earth mark a region that once became the seat of kings who ruled during one of Egypt's most uncertain political chapters. Among them was Merikare, a ruler whose name survived in literature, yet whose tomb has never been securely found. For a king of Egypt, that absence is remarkable. Merikare is generally placed toward the end of the first intermediate period, during the era when the Heracleopolitan rulers of northern Egypt competed for power with the Theban rulers of the south. His exact position within the dynasty remains difficult to establish, and even the chronology of his reign is uncertain. Unlike the great monarchs of the Old Kingdom, Merikare left no securely identified pyramid or monumental funerary complex bearing his name. His burial has simply disappeared. That does not necessarily mean that a pyramid once stood somewhere and was later destroyed. The evidence for a pyramid belonging specifically to Merikare has never been firmly established. The phrase "missing pyramid" is therefore best understood as a description of an unresolved royal burial, rather than proof that archaeologists know a pyramid once existed. And that distinction opens a much deeper mystery. Why has the burial of a king whose name was important enough to survive in Egyptian literary tradition remained unidentified? Merikare belonged to a world very different from the age of Khufu or Menkaure. By this period, Egypt had experienced political fragmentation. The centralized authority that had supported the Great Pyramid projects of the Old Kingdom had weakened, while regional centers became increasingly powerful. Heracleopolis, in Middle Egypt, emerged as the political heart of the Northern Kingdom. To the south, Thebes was developing its own royal authority. For generations, these competing powers existed within the same Nile Valley, each claiming legitimacy. The result was not necessarily the complete collapse once imagined by older histories, but rather a complicated period of regional competition, changing alliances, and shifting political control. Merikare ruled within that unsettled landscape. One of the most fascinating sources associated with his name is the text commonly called the Teaching for King Merikare. Surviving manuscripts are considerably later than his lifetime, so the text cannot be treated as a verbatim document written by his father. Nevertheless, it preserves a tradition connected with the Heracleopolitan royal house and provides an unusually reflective portrait of kingship. The supposed father advises the young ruler on maintaining order, controlling rebellion, treating subjects carefully, and dealing with enemies. The text repeatedly emphasizes the consequences of royal decisions. For a civilization famous for monumental stone architecture, the contrast is striking. Merikare's physical monument remains unknown, while his intellectual legacy survives through words. Perhaps that tells us something about the circumstances of his reign. A ruler governing during political uncertainty may not have possessed the enormous resources available to the kings of the Fourth Dynasty. His court may have prioritized defense, administration, diplomacy, and maintaining authority over competing territories rather than constructing a massive stone monument. His tomb could therefore have been considerably smaller than the pyramids associated with Egypt's earlier kings. It might have been constructed from mudbrick, limestone, or other materials vulnerable to later destruction. It may have been robbed in antiquity. Its stones could have been removed and reused. Or the tomb may still exist beneath a modern settlement or an archaeological area that has not yet revealed its original purpose. The geography of Hierakonpolis adds another layer of uncertainty. The royal cemetery of this political center has not provided historians with a clearly identifiable funerary complex for Merikare comparable to those associated with better-known pharaohs. Without a royal name carved into an intact structure, assigning an anonymous tomb to him would be speculative. And ancient Egypt offers many examples of structures whose original identities became obscure. A tomb could be robbed, stripped of its funerary equipment, reused by another individual, and eventually buried beneath layers of sediment and later activity. Once its inscriptions disappeared, the connection to its original owner could become almost impossible to reconstruct. Merikare's burial may have suffered precisely this fate. There is also a political dimension worth considering. The Hierakonpolis dynasty eventually lost its struggle against the Theban rulers. Nebhepetre Mentuhotep II ultimately reunited Egypt, establishing the political foundation of the Middle Kingdom. What happened to the monuments of the defeated northern kings? It would be easy to assume that their funerary complexes were deliberately destroyed by their successors. Ancient Egyptian history does contain episodes of political erasure, monument alteration, and deliberate suppression of royal memory. But there is no firm evidence demonstrating that Merikare's burial was specifically demolished by the Thebans. A less dramatic explanation may be more plausible. Time itself can erase monuments. Flooding, erosion, stone robbing, agricultural activity, later construction, and the gradual transformation of the landscape can destroy even substantial structures. A royal tomb does not need to be deliberately attacked to disappear. There is another possibility that makes the mystery even more intriguing. Perhaps Merikare never possessed a pyramid at all. The tradition of royal pyramid building had already changed considerably by the First Intermediate Period. Elite funerary architecture was evolving, and the political conditions that had produced the enormous royal pyramids of earlier centuries no longer existed in the same form. Merikare may have been buried in a conventional royal tomb rather than a pyramid. If so, generations of searching for a monumental pyramid could be looking for the wrong type of monument. His final resting place might have been modest by comparison, yet still carefully constructed according to the funerary customs of his time. The lack of a known tomb also means that Merikare's burial goods remain unknown. We cannot confidently reconstruct what objects accompanied him, what rituals were performed, or how his court presented his transition into the afterlife. That silence is unusual, because Egyptian funerary culture was built around remembrance. Names were carved into stone precisely so that the deceased would not disappear. Yet, Merikare's name survived while the physical place intended to preserve it has been lost. Could his tomb still be waiting beneath the soil of the Hierakonpolis region? Could a structure already excavated but poorly understood eventually prove to be connected with his reign? Or was his burial so modest, so damaged, or so thoroughly reused that the archaeological trail has effectively ended? More speculative theories sometimes imagine a deliberate concealment of the king's burial, perhaps connected with the political struggle between northern and southern Egypt. Such ideas are difficult to demonstrate, and there is currently no compelling evidence that Merikare's tomb was intentionally hidden from later generations. Yet, the political setting makes the question understandable. A king whose dynasty was defeated could have had his monuments neglected, dismantled, or simply abandoned. Once the Middle Kingdom began, the royal ideology of the reunified state naturally placed greater emphasis on the Theban rulers who had restored centralized authority. The old Heracleopolitan kings gradually became distant figures, and Merikare is an especially unusual example because his literary reputation outlasted his physical monument. The teaching for Merikare presents a ruler concerned with order, justice, conflict, and the responsibilities of power. Whether those words originated directly from his court or were shaped by later scribes, they preserve the memory of a king who stood at a critical moment in Egyptian history. But the earth has preserved no confirmed royal chamber bearing his name. No securely identified pyramid rises from the landscape. No intact funerary complex has revealed where his reign ended. Perhaps the answer is buried somewhere near Hierakonpolis, beneath layers of soil and later construction. Perhaps another inscription will one day connect an anonymous tomb with the elusive king. Or perhaps Merikare's burial was never monumental enough to leave an obvious trace. For now, the evidence stops at the edge of uncertainty. A king remembered in one of Egypt's most reflective texts remains without a securely identified final resting place. His words survived through generations, while the monument that was supposed to preserve his royal identity disappeared from view. And somewhere in the ancient landscape of Middle Egypt, there may still be a forgotten chamber waiting to reveal whether Merikare truly possessed the royal monument historians have searched for, or whether the mystery began with an assumption that was never correct in the first place. The story of Egypt's uncertain kings becomes even more difficult to unravel when the evidence comes from a single, modest monument rather than a great royal complex. At Abydos, where generations of Egyptian rulers were buried and remembered, a small limestone stela preserves the name of a king whose political world has almost completely disappeared. His name was Wepwawetemsaf. Wepwawet is his protection, and beyond that inscription, remarkably little can be said with certainty. The stela is only about 28 centimeters high, yet its surface carries an entire royal identity. At the top is a winged sun disk flanked by uraei. Below it, hieroglyphic text records the king's titulary, while another scene shows Wepwawetemsaf before the jackal-headed god Wepwawet, the ancient deity whose name means something like opener of the ways. The object is now preserved in the British Museum as EA969. It is an unusually humble monument for a pharaoh. There is no surviving pyramid bearing his name. No confirmed royal palace has been identified. No securely attributed tomb has revealed his burial equipment. Instead, the king survives through a single contemporary stela of notably modest workmanship, discovered at Abydos and produced by a local workshop. And that small stone opens a much larger mystery. Who exactly was Wepwawetemsaf? The answer depends partly on how we reconstruct one of the most complicated periods in Egyptian political history, the Second Intermediate Period. By this time, the unified Egyptian state of earlier centuries had fractured into competing centers of authority. The Hyksos controlled a powerful kingdom in the north, while rulers in Upper Egypt maintained their own political traditions. Between these larger powers, smaller royal centers may also have emerged. Abydos was particularly important. For centuries, the city had been one of Egypt's most sacred places. It was associated with Osiris, the god of the dead, and with royal ancestors whose tombs stretched back toward the beginnings of Egyptian kingship. During periods of political fragmentation, controlling Abydos was therefore more than a matter of occupying a city. It meant possessing a place loaded with religious and historical authority. This is where Wepwawetemsaf enters the story. Some Egyptologists, particularly Kim Ryholt, have argued that he belonged to what is often called the Abydos dynasty, a proposed group of local rulers who controlled part of Upper Egypt during the later Second Intermediate Period. In this interpretation, Wepwawetemsaf was one of several kings who ruled from the Abydos region, while Egypt was divided among competing powers. The theory is appealing for a simple reason. His name itself invokes Wepwawet, the ancient god strongly associated with Abydos. The king's name essentially places the god directly within his royal identity, and his only securely contemporary monument was produced at Abydos. Taken together, these clues can suggest a ruler whose authority was closely tied to the sacred landscape of the city. But there is an important problem. Not every Egyptologist accepts the existence of a distinct Abydos dynasty. The chronology of the Second Intermediate Period remains contested, and Wepwawetemsaf has been assigned to different points within it. Jürgen von Beckerath placed him among the later rulers of the 13th dynasty, while Marcel Marais has argued for a position in the later 16th dynasty. These interpretations are not minor variations. They place the king within different political environments and change our understanding of who may have controlled Abydos at the time. So even the dynasty of this king remains uncertain. The problem becomes more interesting when his stela is compared with other monuments. The same Abydos workshop appears to have produced monuments connected with other obscure rulers, including Panchani and Rahotep. Marais has argued that the artistic similarities may indicate that these kings ruled relatively close together in time. If so, Wepwawetemsaf might belong not to an independent Abydos dynasty, but to the political sequence of rulers traditionally associated with the late 16th or early 17th dynasties. In other words, the stela may preserve evidence of a king, but it does not tell us exactly where to place him. This is one of the recurring problems with Egypt's obscure rulers. A royal name can survive while the political world surrounding that name disappears. There is also a possible second piece of evidence. A graffito from the tomb of the Middle Kingdom official Amenemhat at Beni Hassan, far to the north of Abydos. The inscription has been tentatively read as the praenomen Sekemra Neferkau, the throne name associated with Wepwawetemsaf. But the original graffito is now lost, and the reading itself remains uncertain. Consequently, it cannot provide the same level of confidence as the Abydos stela. If the identification were correct, however, it would be intriguing. It could suggest that Wepwawetemsaf's authority, or at least his name, reached considerably farther north than the surviving Abydos evidence indicates. But perhaps the most important mystery is not where the king ruled. It is what happened to his kingdom. If Wepwawetemsaf really was one of the rulers of an independent political center at Abydos, then his reign belongs to a short-lived episode in which Upper Egypt was divided among local powers. These rulers would have maintained courts, armies, religious institutions, and systems of administration, even though later Egyptian history preserved very little of their activities. Their monuments were vulnerable. A small kingdom does not necessarily possess the resources to build monumental complexes that survive for thousands of years. A royal tomb could be robbed, dismantled, reused, or buried. A chapel could disappear beneath later construction. Even a stone stela could be separated from its original setting and eventually enter a collection far from Egypt. The stela of Wepwawetemsaf illustrates exactly how fragile that historical record can be. We know his throne name. We know his personal name. We know that he presented himself before Wepwawet. We know that his monument was created at Abydos during the Second Intermediate Period. But we do not know with certainty where his royal residence stood, how long he ruled, how extensive his territory was, or where his body was ultimately placed. And his burial may be the most tantalizing missing piece. Abydos contains an extraordinary concentration of royal tombs from different periods. The landscape around the sacred cemetery continued to attract rulers long after the great kings of the First Dynasty. Modern excavations have shown that the royal necropolis at South Abydos preserves evidence for a complicated sequence of royal tomb construction during the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. In recent decades, archaeological work has revealed just how much remained hidden there. The discovery of the tomb of King Snaaib, for example, demonstrated that a previously obscure royal figure could still have a substantial funerary monument waiting beneath the soil. Other royal tombs and associated structures have complicated the chronology of the region even further. Modern excavations continue to reveal how this royal cemetery developed during periods of political fragmentation. Could Wepwawetemsaf have possessed a similarly bodiced royal tomb? It is certainly possible, but no securely identified burial has yet been connected to him. That absence has encouraged broader speculation. Perhaps his tomb lies somewhere within the Abydos royal necropolis, its inscriptions destroyed or its burial equipment scattered. Perhaps the structure has already been excavated but cannot be confidently attributed to him. Or perhaps his burial was never monumental enough to survive clearly. More imaginative theories sometimes portray the obscure kings of Abydos as members of a secret political order, deliberately erased by stronger dynasties. Such ideas are difficult to support archaeologically. Political erasure did occur in ancient Egypt, but the absence of monuments alone is not evidence of a deliberate campaign against Wepwawetemsaf. There may be a simpler explanation. He may have ruled briefly. His kingdom may have been small. His successors may have been more powerful, and centuries of rebuilding may simply have removed most of the physical evidence. Yet, the stone survived. Its crude workmanship almost makes the survival more remarkable. It was not a colossal monument designed to dominate the landscape. It was a relatively small object created in a local workshop, carrying the name of a ruler whose kingdom may have existed for only a short time. And somehow, that modest stone crossed the centuries while the larger political story surrounding it disappeared. Perhaps this is why Wepwawetemsaf remains so compelling. He is not mysterious because the evidence is completely absent. He is mysterious because just enough survives to prove that he was real, while almost everything needed to understand his reign has vanished. The name tells us that he belonged to a world in which royal authority, regional politics, and the sacred power of Abydos were deeply intertwined. The stela places him before Wepwawet, the ancient opener of the ways, as if the god himself stood between the king and whatever awaited beyond the limits of earthly power. But where did that path lead for Wepwawetemsaf? To a royal tomb still concealed somewhere in the Abydos necropolis, to a burial that was dismantled and forgotten, or to a modest grave that never carried the monumental signs expected of a pharaoh. The evidence for Egypt's lesser-known kings often survives in fragments. A damaged inscription, a seal impression, a broken statue, or a small stela rescued from the ruins of an ancient sanctuary. Few examples illustrate this fragility better than the ruler known as Snaaib. His name appears on a single remarkable monument from Abydos, yet that modest stone has generated a much larger question. Who was this obscure pharaoh, and what kind of kingdom did he rule? At the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is a painted limestone stela catalogued as CG 20517. It was discovered at Abydos, at Qom Sultan, and was dedicated to the worship of the god Min Horus Nakht. The monument identifies its royal patron through several elements of his titulary, and depicts him wearing the blue Kepresh crown while standing before the deity. The workmanship is notably rough, especially when compared with the polished royal monuments of Egypt's great centralized dynasties. Yet, the roughness of the monument makes its survival even more intriguing. Snaaib was not a legendary figure created by much later tradition. The stela provides direct archaeological evidence that a king bearing this name existed during the Second Intermediate period. His throne name is generally reconstructed as Menkaure, while his Horus name is Sewajtawi, he who causes the two lands to flourish. His personal name, Snaaib, has been interpreted approximately as calm of heart. Beyond these titles, however, the record becomes remarkably thin. There is no securely identified pyramid belonging to him. No confirmed royal tomb bears his name. No substantial palace complex has been attributed to his reign. There are no long historical inscriptions describing his wars, family, building projects, or succession. Instead, almost the entire historical personality of Snaaib is concentrated in one piece of limestone. And this is where the uncertainty begins. The Second Intermediate Period was one of the most politically fragmented chapters in Egyptian history. The unified monarchy of earlier centuries had fractured into competing kingdoms and regional powers. In the north, rulers associated with the Hyksos controlled a substantial territory centered on Avaris. In the south, Theban kings developed their own royal line. Between these larger powers, other local authorities may have controlled smaller territories. Abydos appears to have been one of the most important of these contested regions. For Egyptians, Abydos was not simply another settlement. It was an ancient religious center associated with Osiris and with the earliest royal traditions of the Nile Valley. Control of the area carried symbolic importance that went far beyond its physical size. And Snaaib's only known contemporary monument comes from precisely this environment. Could that coincidence be significant? Several Egyptologists have argued that it is. Kim Ryholt and Daryl Baker have associated Snaaib with the proposed Abydos dynasty, a group of local rulers believed to have controlled part of Upper Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. In this reconstruction, Snaaib was one of a series of kings who maintained an independent royal authority in the Abydos region while other dynasties governed elsewhere. His exact position within that proposed dynasty remains uncertain. The idea gained additional support from archaeological discoveries at South Abydos. Excavations there revealed a royal necropolis containing previously obscure rulers, including King Senebkay. Their tombs demonstrated that an independent royal center existed at Abydos during the Second Intermediate Period, and the cemetery has been interpreted as evidence for a small Upper Egyptian kingdom operating alongside the larger political powers of the age. For Snaaib, this is an important piece of context. If he belonged to this local kingdom, then his modest stela may not represent the monument of an insignificant ruler. It may instead be the surviving remnant of a royal court that possessed limited resources but still maintained the traditional language of Egyptian kingship. The distinction matters. A small kingdom could still have a pharaoh. It could maintain a royal titulary, religious institutions, military forces, administrative structures, and a court. But it might lack the enormous resources required to produce the monumental architecture associated with the Old Kingdom. This could help explain why Snaaib is so difficult to trace. His kingdom may have been real, but geographically limited. His reign may have been brief. His monuments may have been modest, and later political changes may have erased most of the physical evidence. Yet, not all scholars accept the Abydos dynasty reconstruction. Jürgen von Beckerath, for example, placed Snaaib near the end of the 13th dynasty rather than treating him as a ruler of an independent Abydos kingdom. Other chronological reconstructions have connected him differently with the 16th dynasty. The disagreement demonstrates just how difficult it is to position a king known primarily from one monument. The problem is not simply that Snaaib has been forgotten. It is that the political map of his lifetime remains disputed. If he belonged to a local Abydos kingdom, he represents evidence for an even more fragmented Egypt than some traditional chronologies suggest. If he belonged instead to the later 13th or 16th dynasty framework, his stela would have to be understood within a different sequence of rulers and political events. The same object can therefore tell very different stories depending on where it is placed in time. Even the quality of the stela is revealing. The monument has been described as exceptionally crude in workmanship, yet it contains a complete royal titulary and carefully structured religious imagery. Snaaib is shown wearing the capresh, the blue crown later strongly associated with the pharaoh, while he approaches Min Horus Nakht. This may represent an important moment in Egyptian royal iconography. The stela is regarded as the earliest known depiction of a king wearing the capresh crown. Why would such a modest local monument preserve such an important image? Perhaps Snaaib's court was emphasizing its legitimacy. In a politically divided Egypt, royal symbolism mattered. A ruler did not simply need soldiers and administrators, he needed the visual language of kingship. The crown, royal names, divine associations, and ritual presentation all communicated that the person standing before the god possessed legitimate authority. Snaaib's stela may therefore have been more than a devotional object. It could have been a statement. Here stood a king. Here stood a ruler who claimed the traditional authority of the pharaoh, even in an age when Egypt no longer possessed a single uncontested monarch. That possibility becomes particularly interesting when the god on the stela is considered. Min was an ancient fertility and fertility-related deity whose cult was particularly important at several Egyptian centers. At Abydos, the combination Min Horus Nakht connected local religious tradition with the broader royal symbolism of Horus. Snaaib therefore appears within a carefully constructed religious environment rather than as an isolated political figure. Perhaps his legitimacy depended partly upon this connection. The king stood before the god. The god represented divine authority. The royal titulary identified Snaaib as the legitimate ruler. The entire scene could be read as a compact expression of kingship during political uncertainty. But then the trail stops. There is no extensive account of Snaaib's reign. No known campaign records describe his army. No surviving inscription tells us whether he fought the Hyksos, negotiated with Thebes, or simply maintained authority over a limited territory. We do not even know how long he ruled, and that absence leaves room for several possibilities. One is that Snaaib was simply a short-lived regional king whose reign produced very little monumental architecture. Another is that his kingdom existed during a brief period of political opportunity, emerging as larger powers weakened and disappearing when those powers expanded again. A third possibility is that later historians have misunderstood his position entirely. Perhaps Snaaib was not part of a separate Abydos dynasty at all. Perhaps the proposed dynasty itself represents a reconstruction from fragmentary evidence rather than a political institution recognized by the Egyptians themselves. This is not an accusation of error so much as a reminder of how difficult the period is to reconstruct. The surviving king lists contain gaps. Some rulers are known only from isolated objects, and royal names can appear far from the places where those kings originally ruled. In this environment, every new archaeological discovery can alter the picture. The discovery of the South Abydos Royal Cemetery is a good example. Before the identification of Senebke and other royal tombs, the possibility of an independent Abydos kingdom was much harder to demonstrate physically. The cemetery provided tangible evidence that obscure rulers could indeed maintain royal burial traditions in the region during this period. Could Snaaib's own burial be somewhere nearby? That remains unknown. If he belonged to the same political environment, his tomb might conceivably lie within the broader royal landscape of South Abydos. But no tomb has been securely attributed to him. There is also no archaeological basis for claiming that his burial was deliberately hidden or destroyed. a more ordinary explanation may be sufficient. His tomb could have been robbed. Its stone could have been reused. Its inscriptions could have been damaged beyond recognition. Or it may simply remain undiscovered. The fate of Snaaib's monuments may also have been shaped by the political transition that eventually brought Upper and Lower Egypt back under. The trail of Egypt's obscure rulers now leads much farther back, to a time when kingship itself was still taking shape, long before the Great Pyramids rose above the Nile Valley, before royal names were arranged into the dynasties familiar from later Egyptian history. Scattered signs of authority were already appearing on stone, ivory, and ceremonial objects. Among the most elusive of these early figures is a ruler conventionally called Penabus, or Penabu. The name is not preserved in a royal tomb, a monumental temple, or a later king list. Instead, it emerges from a handful of fragmentary objects and rock inscriptions associated with the late pre-dynastic period, probably around the end of the 4th millennium BC. Even the reading of the name is disputed, which means that the king's identity begins with uncertainty at the most basic level. What exactly did the ancient signs represent? One proposed interpretation sees an elephant. Another possibility has been a rhinoceros. Other Egyptologists have read the signs differently altogether. For this reason, many scholars prefer the cautious designation King Elephant, rather than treating Penabu as an unquestionably established pharaoh. The ruler's very existence is debated, and the surviving evidence is too fragmentary to provide the certainty available for later kings. Yet, the fragments are fascinating. At Qustul in Nubia, near the First Cataract region, rock inscriptions have been interpreted as containing the signs associated with Penabu. Similar imagery has also been connected with Gebel Sheikh Suleiman. Other objects from Abydos, including ivory tags associated with the earliest royal cemetery, have been proposed as additional attestations of the same figure. Although these examples do not carry the royal serif in the way some of the rock inscriptions appear to. If these readings are correct, they would place Penabu within a formative period when the institutions of Egyptian kingship were still developing, and that is where the mystery deepens. A name hidden in an animal. The most intriguing feature of Penabu is the possible animal sign. Günter Dreyer and Ludwig David Morens have interpreted the image as an elephant, while acknowledging difficulties in the early writing. Morens has also considered the possibility of a rhinoceros. Other Egyptologists, including Toby Wilkinson and Peter Kaplony, have proposed completely different readings of the sign. To modern eyes, this may seem like a minor disagreement over a drawing. It is not. A single sign can change the identity of the king. If the image represents an elephant, then the ruler's name could reflect an animal that possessed considerable symbolic power in the Nile Valley in northeastern Africa. If it represents a rhinoceros, the symbolism changes entirely. If the sign is neither animal, then the name Penabu itself may be a modern reconstruction built upon a mistaken reading. The uncertainty therefore reaches into the title of the mystery itself. Was there really a king called Penabu? Or are we seeing an ancient symbol whose original meaning has been lost? During the late pre-dynastic period, powerful animals appear repeatedly in royal imagery. Lions, crocodiles, falcons, scorpions, elephants, and other dangerous creatures could be incorporated into the symbolic vocabulary of emerging rulers. Such imagery may have expressed strength, aggression, control over nature, or a ruler's association with particular territories and divine forces. An elephant would have carried particular significance because wild elephants were present much farther north in Africa during earlier periods than they are today. The animal was large, powerful, unpredictable, and difficult to control, qualities that could easily acquire political meaning. But we should be careful. There is no surviving text explaining why this particular symbol was chosen. We do not know whether Pen-Abu personally used an elephant as a royal emblem, whether the image represented a geographic association, or whether later scholars have simply imposed an attractive interpretation on an ambiguous sign. The ancient image remains silent. If Pen-Abu was indeed a ruler, he belonged to an era that existed before Egypt's conventional First Dynasty. This distinction is important. The word pharaoh is often applied broadly to Egypt's rulers, but the political institution we recognize from later dynastic Egypt was still developing during this earlier period. There was no neat boundary separating prehistoric Egypt from a fully formed Egyptian state. Instead, archaeological evidence reveals a gradual process. Regional centers grew, long-distance trade expanded, elite burials became increasingly elaborate. Administrative marks appeared on pottery, ivory, and other objects. Royal symbolism became more standardized, and eventually rulers began using increasingly recognizable forms of royal titulary. Pen-Abu appears somewhere within this transformation. His proposed inscriptions at Kustul and Gebel Sheikh Suleiman are particularly interesting because they belong to a region that was not simply a peripheral wilderness. The Nile corridor south of Egypt was already connected to communities involved in trade, cultural exchange, and competition over valuable resources. Kustul itself later became famous for discoveries that generated intense debate about the relationship between Upper Egypt and Nubia during the formation of the Egyptian state. Could Pen-Abu have been one of the rulers who operated within this southern frontier? Perhaps, but the evidence does not allow us to establish a kingdom with confidence. The rock inscriptions do not provide a political map. They do not tell us the extent of his authority. They do not record military campaigns. They do not identify a capital, and they do not reveal where he was buried. All of those details have to remain open. The most intriguing part of the story comes from Abydos. The cemetery at al-Kab preserves some of the earliest known royal burials in Egypt. Long before the enormous pyramids of later dynasties, rulers were already being placed within increasingly organized funerary complexes there. Among the objects recovered from these early royal tombs are ivory labels carrying some of the earliest forms of Egyptian writing. Several scholars have connected examples from these collections with the enigmatic Pen-Abu, although the absence of a serif on the Abydos examples makes the identification less secure than the rock inscriptions. This creates an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the same ruler represented at Kustul was somehow connected with the royal center at Abydos. If true, the evidence could point toward a period when authority extended across a surprisingly broad stretch of the Nile Valley. But there is another interpretation. The marks on the ivory pieces might not refer to Pen-Abu at all. They may represent another person, another place, another animal, or a symbol whose meaning has not yet been correctly understood. This is one of the hazards of studying Egypt's earliest writing. The signs are not yet as standardized as the hieroglyphic system of later centuries. Some images could carry multiple meanings, and the distinction between an object, a name, a place, and a religious symbol was not always as clear as it would become. A single elephant-like figure could therefore be much more difficult to interpret than it appears. Suppose, however, that the identification is correct. Suppose an early ruler really did use the name Pen-Abu and was associated with an elephant. What would that tell us? Perhaps his authority was connected with regions where elephants were still encountered. Perhaps the animal represented military strength. Perhaps it was an emblem of a particular clan or political territory. Or perhaps the elephant was simply a royal symbol chosen because of its extraordinary power. There is also a more speculative possibility. The use of dangerous animals in early royal names may reflect a stage when rulers were constructing identities through powerful natural forces rather than through the fully developed divine kingship seen in later Egypt. In this interpretation, the ruler was not merely claiming political control. He was presenting himself through an image of something formidable. The elephant became a statement of strength. The crocodile became a statement of danger. The falcon became associated with the emerging Horus tradition. Such symbolism could have helped transform individual rulers into enduring political figures. But this remains interpretation rather than established fact. There is no surviving inscription saying, "I chose the elephant because." The ancient evidence simply does not give us that explanation, and that silence is important. Perhaps the greatest gap in Penabu's story is his burial. For rulers of later dynasties, the tomb often provides the foundation for reconstructing a reign. Names, titles, funerary equipment, inscriptions, architectural plans, and associated burials can reveal an extraordinary amount. For Penabu, none of that certainty exists. His proposed burial location is unknown. No securely identified royal tomb bears his name. There is no confirmed funerary complex from which his reign can be reconstructed. This means that even if the inscriptions genuinely belong to him, we cannot tell whether he was an influential regional ruler, a minor local king, or simply one participant in a much broader network of emerging authorities. The absence of a tomb does not necessarily mean that he was erased. The simplest explanation may be that his burial has never been identified.